Emily, do you all have a presentation? You're just ready? Okay, okay, okay. So just, yeah, just let me know. Okay. We need to have better communication. Are you talking about Eric or Christian? Okay, we've already prepped. We're ready. Oh, yeah, yeah, Eric is harder.
Oh, I sneeze all the time these days. Sorry about that. I froze myself up a little bit, but
Okay, I think we are ready. We'll call today's markup session for the FY20 budget into order. Today we have members DeFerranti and Crystal, along with Vice Chair Garvey and Chair Dorsey attending in person, and coming to us from a secure remote location is member Gutschall. Are you here, Mr. Gutschall?
I'm present.
I'll take that as a yes. All right, so Mr. Gutschall, feel free to go back on mute, and I've got my phone with me, and you can text me whenever you'd like to be recognized. So today we have our final work on the FY20 budget and a draft proposal for our consideration, as well as we should probably take this opportunity to at least surface verbally any intended budget guidance that we would like to offer as we near ourselves to completion of the FY20 budget. So why don't we begin with the draft proposal, and each of you should have a copy in front of you, and I don't know if we're going to put the spreadsheet on the screen for people who are following in the room and at home. I'll just briefly explain what it is that's before us. Some of the top line issues. This is a budget that has with it an increase of 2 cents in the assessed tax rate, and 1.5 cents is directed towards funding Arlington Public Schools, with a ½ cent for Arlington County government operations. And I'll go into some detail about what this means for the schools a little bit later on, which is a little bit different than what I shared with you all in an earlier draft. But as we go through some of the changes to the budget from the manager's proposal, there are a fair number of substantial changes. One is the amount of money that we're devoting to land acquisition. We had a later proposal, revised proposal from the manager at $12.2 million. That for this draft is at $10 million. And that has also come with some other changes, substantial changes. The gap in WMATA funding, which we knew was nearly $2 million, is now being covered with existing funds that were devoted to pay-as-you-go funding. So that is fully funded within the budget without an increase attached to it. And then there are some changes that reflect what I have heard from colleagues as priorities for us in this budget cycle, allowing the Electoral Board to prepare for the 2020 election by actually funding 4/10 of an FTE that they are currently actually fully utilizing, but just without the budget authority to spend. And this is going to give them the ability to make sure that they're fully resourced for the biggest election year that they have on a 4-year cycle. Neighborhood College, no one intended for that program to substantively change, so we need a budget allotment to make sure that that is able to continue as it did in FY19, so that's at $40,000. There is a one-time allotment to the nonprofit organization Aspire that is occupying space at Arlington Mill Community Center. There are some HVAC relocation requirements that they have for the build out of that space, but as we all know, it is not their space. They are leasing it from us, and when they are in fact not using it, that will be available to Arlington County. And at the expiration of that lease, that space, as well as that capital improvement, will be available to Arlington. We had needs from the organization Doorways for funding to meet their domestic violence hotline, and most of that is available in ongoing funding with a supplement to, or with the difference being made up in some one-time funding. The partnerships that assist the county in developing our neighborhood corridors and sectors, Lee Highway Alliance, Clarendon Alliance, and the Columbia Pike Revitalization Organization, all had needs or requests in excess of what this mark provides them. For Lee Highway and Columbia Pike, it's $20,000. Clarendon Alliance, it's $10,000. But you should know that overall, this reflects 85% of Lee Highway's total ask, 95% of the Clarendon Alliance's total ask, and 93% of the total ask for CPRO. Community Services Board came to us with 2.5 positions that they requested. This draft budget funds 1.5 of those positions, leaving it to the CSB to determine how to best utilize the resources to meet those staffing priorities. The Affordable Housing Investment Fund is leveled up and leveled at $16 million. Cultural affairs, we heard significant amounts of conversation about losing cultural affairs programming, including the Poet Laureate, programs that work with children in schools. And in order to continue that, there's about $11,500 of funding required in direct payments services for those programs, as well as a need to staff and coordinate that, which could be accomplished by a contract employee, $31,000 for that. We heard from the Arlington Food Assistance Center, and this would provide 75% of their funding request. And what you see in that last line is the offset to the Metro funding coming from pay-as-you-go. As we move to schools, which is a big part of our budget, just to give you some bottom line numbers, this would move the revenue share percentage to 47% of local revenues going to schools. Year over year, it's a 6.3% increase in the transfer from Arlington County to public schools. And this would effectively fund 99.999% of their budget request, which most of us would consider fully funding what the schools have asked us for. In order to accomplish that, there is a mixture of one-time and ongoing funding, but on balance, we are substantially funding the APS increase, 61% at least. That may change a little bit with some of the most recent changes going a little higher, but those are coming from, going a little bit lower, but not substantially, from ongoing revenues. So still, we are making sure that we are not structurally challenging APS in future budget years. And I think that's all I'll say about the actual contents of the budget, what it means for the Arlington taxpayer. If you are a household that has a home with an average Arlington home value, this would be a 2.8% increase year over year in your tax and fee responsibilities. Remember, it is not just this tax rate as well as the increase in assessments, but there are also some rate reductions that are baked into this budget that we will be considering adopting. So the impact on households with average home values, 2.8%. So questions, discussion, alternatives, amendments, criticisms, hopes and dreams.
So I guess you started with hopes and dreams. I mean, at first, the budget, a thank you on the AHIF funding, that's a significant step. And also on the schools, those are, of course, big priorities for all of us, but they're also priorities for me. And then on guidance, I'd be curious to learn whether you think it'd be appropriate on getting the last 0.4% for our electoral board staffing. Maybe it's a question for the manager. It might be for you. It's about, if there's, depending on the primary in 2020, there could be additional costs, and I believe there was a discussion of contingency earlier. I'm just curious as to whether that is something that either the manager or in your consideration, I think it's probably for the manager and Richard.
Gladly defer to Mr. Schwartz.
Right, so if the registrar finds that there's a need that she's unable to meet, then we'll potentially come back, either have that out, we have a contingent fund that the board has access to, also manager's contingent, and then there's always the possibility, though it's disfavored with closeout, to try to address it. So we have several ways to do that.
Okay, so I'll take that. We're good on guidance, wouldn't be needed on that. And then I guess just to colleagues and also to the manager, I might come back. Appreciate all the dialogue that has gone on with respect to the solid waste and composting, and that is something that I don't know that education and guidance would be necessary in this case, but I do appreciate all the dialogue that's happened on that, and I feel like we're as prepared as we can be for when that would come online. So that's all I have at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Crystal. Oh, no,
Thank
you're
you.
just moving.
No, oh, no, I do.
Oh, you do? Okay, great.
Absolutely, thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, first, thank you very much for the effort to prepare this. I found it to be really responsive to, I know, priorities of board members as well as many we heard from the community. One question for the manager, and then just a bit of discussion for the 4 or 5 of us, with Mr. Gutschall on the phone. Mr. Manager, just want to make sure I'm understanding, because I know we did have some discussion about this during the work session with regard to neighborhood college. And so by restoring $40K in one-time money, this essentially keeps the program functioning as is with consultant support, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, and so the proposal that you had discussed during, or rather, I think perhaps departmental leadership had discussed during our CPHD work session to explore a further partnership with an existing community nonprofit to suggest other ways of delivering that program. Will that continue? This is sort of keeps the program functioning as we know it for the next year while that exploration moves forward?
It's my intention that over the next number of months that we would continue conversations, not just with the group I identified, but potentially anybody who could provide as a contractor, provide those services, with the following understanding, which is that the only way I would pursue that is if somehow we could increase the number of participants in the process at the same cost or a lower cost. It's not my intention to change what we have now unless we could get more throughput with the same level of quality. And I'll be back to the board before we do anything on that.
All right, that's very helpful to me. I obviously, as a graduate, I'm a little biased, but I think that's a program that's working extraordinarily well, and want to make sure that we're not accidentally changing it as we almost were positioned to do in this budget. The other question I had was for colleagues, actually, maybe for the discussion amongst us. With regard to the nonprofit contributions in this budget, I am pleased and very supportive of the additional funding for both Aspire and Doorways, and I think in those circumstances, there's a unique case to be made about the relationship that they have with the county. Certainly in the case of Aspire, that is actually paying for an improvement to a county facility, which is a unique circumstance, and I think very defensible in that regard. Doorways, as we discussed during the DHS work session, is delivering I don't know if I'd call it fee-for-service, but a partnership with the county through operations of the hotline, and they've seen in turn those accompaniments increase by 1,400% since the contract award, and so I think, again, there's sort of a uniqueness there. The one that I would love to hear from colleagues a little more thinking about was on line 68, the Arlington Food Assistance Center, which does spectacular work, but so do many of our nonprofits in the community. And so would love to hear from others, perhaps from our chair, but also my colleagues about why the 37.5 to Arlington Food Assistance Center relative to other nonprofits who might have similar asks.
Beautiful, thank you. If I can, before addressing your direct questions, I do want to go back to Neighborhood College just to make sure, one, that you are not biased. I'm not a graduate of the program and find it incredibly valuable and useful. So don't worry, you don't have any implicit issues with how you evaluate that. But also, the $40,000 for Neighborhood College actually is coming from ongoing revenues, so that we make sure that we don't have this issue built in structurally. So do want to deal with that. Of course. And as to your second piece about the Arlington Food Assistance Center, I'll give you the lens that I just applied to it. The county payments to AFAC cover the cost of food. There is volatility in the cost of food. If you look at it, it's not something that can be predicted well from year to year. They've remained at a relatively flat level. I think this increase addresses some of the past volatility and ensures that this will not ensures, but helps to smooth if there are issues with the price of food in the future. So that's really the lens that I applied for that.
And if I could add something too, I mean, we did actually several years ago give them a fair amount more, so that what we had was less. Also, just right now with all of the issue with immigrants and folks being nervous about going to use sometimes services from us that they actually have a right to, but they're afraid to do that. And with the government shutdown and a lot of things, I think there's been a lot of stress on AFAC, and I think they do wonderful work. So I'm really pleased to support this. It's not all of what they asked for, but and it doesn't get them up to where they used to be. So I think they perform a very important service and I think given political situations and things are under more stress than they maybe have always been at times in the past. So I'm pleased to support this. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, Mr. DeFerranti.
You all know this well, but I don't think we've yet said in this conversation that there's the food level of support for AFAC is already at 450-odd thousand. So this is to get back closer to the amount that you all provided 2 years ago. For me, there was also in conversation some analysis about potential for addressing child hunger, which is, and some of the backpack programs. So that was part of what led me to be supportive of the chair's mark. So that's thoughts on that. And if we're done with that, I do have one other issue, but
Yeah, we'll get to it, and I just want to add one other thing, Ms. Crystal. I do want to offer some guidance, which I would have brought up in a little bit. We've kind of been dealing with this issue of how do we fund nonprofits that work with the county for a while, so I'm in the process of conceptualizing some guidance that I hope accomplishes two things. One, directs the manager to come up with a process for evaluating nonprofits with whom we have a vendor or a contractor relationship, things that are solely on the county side, so that we can have evaluated how additional increases come to the board and under what circumstances and under what criteria they should be evaluated. And then two, to ask the manager to assist the board for evaluating requests that come from organizations that don't have contractual relationships with the county, because we do have a number of them from year to year, and I know I have my own lens that I apply, but I think it's probably important that we come up with an organized board process for evaluating, and also to communicate to those nonprofits what they need to present to us in order for us to fairly evaluate them, because really the requests come either at a budget session, they come through very thoughtfully developed materials, they come through in-person briefings, and there's something just unsettling about all that.
I appreciate that so much, Mr. Chair, and what had motivated my question is, my understanding that the Department of Human Services essentially gave the direction to our Community Development Block Grant recipient grantees this year, as they absorbed cuts within their own DHS budget, that there was no additional funding to be had this year, and it was, they asked them to sort of take one for the team and not ask. And so I really want to make sure that we're not in a situation where those nonprofits who are following those instructions or doing what their partners at DHS ask of them aren't actually penalized for not breaking the rules, so to speak. So I appreciate that very much, and I think that to the extent possible, we can see if your guidance can be inclusive of ensuring that direction we give to the manager is what flows to the nonprofits themselves, and have clarity of expectations.
That's terrific, yeah. Okay, great. Matt, Mr. DeFranti.
So I want to ask you about a amendment that I'm considering and wanted to share with you that would be one-time funds to address a couple of short-term opportunities that I think are relevant in the area of energy efficiency, as we think about the past year and all the rain we've gotten, but also the real impacts of climate that we're seeing. And I've been working with staff, and I really appreciate the manager as well as Shannon Flanagan, the deputy county manager, have been sort of giving me ideas, and I've shared a thought. This would be one time and one time only for a couple of different uses. One is staff has identified a possibility of solar going on the pumping station that's in the Williamsburg area, and a feasibility study on that is one purpose. Staff's estimate on that is $50,000. I would propose two possible pay-fors. One would be the land acquisition fund. I'm mindful that we want to make sure we have a lot of resources there, but I believe that with how things look over the coming months, that we have good land acquisition resources. The other two items, one would be a feasibility, an analysis that would be financial, and there might be a small amount of legal resources for an off-site renewable energy power purchase agreement. That would be estimated, I'd actually bring it down slightly to right around $150,000. I just see this as a critical issue. And then the third would be for low-income homeowners and renters in the two opportunity zones that we have. Targeted energy improvements is estimated around $65,000. And so those are the three. There are two routes that we can go here as far as pay-fors. There's also, I am open to guidance, but I also do want to ask respectfully if we can put resources towards this of some amount, because I do think that what the manager proposed is on energy efficiency is strong. I just feel as though there's been enough evidence over the past year that it's worth an additional set of one-time, small amount of one-time investments in this area. So those are the three buckets, and I wanted to raise it.
So raised, let's have a discussion about it. I'll start. Can you tell me just a little bit more about tying the energy retrofits to opportunity zones? It's my understanding that, at least in the Barcroft Opportunity Zone, there are very few people who actually control their own properties. Most are renters, so I'm wondering.
Yeah, so the discussion that I've had so far with Ms. Flanagan has been focused a little bit on the other opportunity zone, which I think is closer to Green Valley.
Yeah.
And I think there are a few more
Yeah, a lot more there.
owned spaces there. And then I also, having worked on the weatherization program, the community action agency that we work with, as I understand it, is out of Winchester. And so it would be targeted to those two areas, but it would not include any full-time employees. And it would be working with a consultant on a targeted basis to see what's possible in Green Valley, and the second opportunity zone may not be as feasible based on the rental relationship. So I'm open to coming further down on it, but I do think as a county, I have been watching, and I'm not sure that we're doing as much on residential energy efficiency as I wish we were, and I totally was persuaded by watching your discussion of the 500,000 that was reduced last year, some of which was targeted at HVAC in wealthier neighborhoods. And I think on a needs-based budget with, as you have proposed, the 2 cents, we need to be really targeted. But I do think it's a double win on the costs for low-income homeowners and for energy efficiency. And so that's sort of my reasoning on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worthy of exploration. Opportunity zones may not be the perfect tool for what you intend. I think a more granular look at census tracts and poverty metrics might work, because, our two opportunity zones are very different in terms of the overall demographics, and I would hate to be replicating that very same thing that we did a couple of years ago, providing opportunities for people who have means to get access to public resources. But thank you for that. Ms. Crystal, and then Ms. Garvey, and then we will not forget you. Mr. Gutschall also wants to weigh in on this.
Just to follow up, I think the two pieces, Mr. DeFrente, of what you proposed, in which I'm most interested, are the kind of program portfolio and analytics for the underserved communities piece, and the Miner Hill solar installation. And we can come back to the latter, maybe discuss that separately while the line of questioning is happening about the former. So I'm always very loath to just turn to the manager and say, couldn't staff take this on within their existing workloads? But I do want to ask that about this piece, because relative to, for example, the Miner Hill is a great example. This is a new municipal net metering is a new area of authority for us as a county per recent General Assembly action. There are others, there are sort of legal analyses required. It would strike me that this sort of energy efficiency programming, partnering with utilities, et cetera, that actually does seem like an area where we have some existing expertise among our AIR staff members. So if, Mr. Manager, you could just respond to a little bit why this wouldn't be something that our existing staff might be able to explore and would need outside support.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding which of the three items you're talking about. So is it are you talking about energy audits or the feasibility study for the pumping?
The energy audits, excuse me. I'm also tracking back to the very helpful response that staff gave to Mr. DeFerranti, that table, from which I think this comes.
So without the benefit of having read that table in the last 48 hours, I could be proven wrong about this. I think that the funding component there is related to the actual costs, and if you want to add to the actual costs of doing the audits as opposed to staff, but.
I had read it as,
Possibly you're correct.
no, I had read it as, and I'm probably misunderstanding it too, but it's the Energy Program Portfolio Analytics Underserved Communities. And the deliverable is proposals for grant and utility partnerships that support the design of energy efficiency programs targeted to underserved community, and ROI assessments of program design. So not the actual technical audit,
Yeah,
but more of the programmatic.
rather than speculating, someone who will perhaps be slightly more informed than us, Mike Moon, has some details.
Thank you, Mr. Moon.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Crystal. That program is actually what it's being alluded to there is, I think, between John Morrell and Demetra McBride, they're looking at an opportunity in that space to perhaps partner with Dominion Energy as our incumbent utility. And with the whole Grid Modernization Act, there may be that opportunity, because this has happened, and we're not unique in this, it's happened over the Commonwealth where we want to direct energy efficiency program to disadvantaged homeowners and renters. And so I think in that aspect here, that's really partnering with some consulting costs to make sure what we're doing to represent our interest and understand that more fully, and to engage productively with Dominion Energy. So that at least that part of it.
Got it. So as we hold Demetra and John in the highest regard, but even they have their limits and would want to bring in some outside expertise. That's what this funding would do.
For the 62,000, I think that's what they
Okay.
thought was.
Thank you.
And just to provide context, you know, these are developed with Demetra and Shannon in the room, but I do think your questions are good ones, because the rigor that we apply to other nonprofits is worth applying, and to all of our spending is worth, of course, applying here. Just on the 2 pages, I do want you to note that what I am proposing, of the 4 different items in that table, there's the Energy Assurance Survey and Plan, which may have merit, but I have not talked about with staff. And given this year's budget, it's something that I would not put in a proposed amendment. It's really the other 3, and within those, I've talked with Mr. McIsaac on, and I think this is fine. You can tell me if I'm wrong, Mr. Moon, but is on the we haven't talked about the second item, which is potentially working with Dominion or another utility on a large off-site renewable energy contract. Inside there, and it's further reduced from the email I shared with you earlier today, is $165,000. Some of that was for legal costs. Mr. McIsaac has said we need less in legal costs. There's expertise in-house, and so it would come closer to an amendment of right around $252,000 that I would float to you guys and want your thoughts on, mindful that we are in a tight budget and there are many competing needs, but also seeking to address what we've seen over the past year and the shared priority on the environment.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you. And I will say, Mr. DeFranti, we thought this was going to be a tight budget, but it's not really been very bad. So it's not, I don't want to over-talk about how tight it's been. So I would be more comfortable, I'm very sympathetic to this whole effort. I'd be more comfortable probably putting something in budget direction to the manager to be looking at it. I'm a little bit not sure that, something done in a few days, even if everybody's in the room, that you really have done the best, kind of the best sort of study's been done. I know there's a young gentleman in DC who's come to talk to me about solar energy, and I sort of just kind of waited. I should have him circle around and talk to everybody. He's got a company, he works with Amazon actually, and has done some very large solar, do we call them farms? I don't know what we call the big solar arrays. Some here in Virginia, and working around the Commonwealth. I think this is an area that's really in flux. I think there are a lot of entities out there. When I was at one of our meetings at the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, we had somebody come talk about public-private partnerships and a lot of interest in doing something even regionally. I don't know where that is now, but there was a lot of interest in it. So I'm a little worried that deciding right now this is exactly what we want might not be as good as stepping back, giving an overall goal for staff and others to really work on over the next year and look at what all is out there, because I think it's a field that, as I say, is constantly changing. And I think there are a lot of private entities out there that we could possibly partner with, of course, as well as Dominion Power. So I'm a little bit more comfortable doing it that way, but it's certainly a laudable area, and I guess, maybe I'll even mention here now, I'm going to be going on a trip with the Northern Virginia Regional Commission to look at renewable energy and how they handle it in Germany, and hope to learn some things which I'll bring back. So anyway, I'm worried it's a little premature, that's all.
All right, Mr. Gutschall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Garvey, actually. I think you sort of teed up my thoughts here rather well, because I think you're absolutely correct in pointing out that there are lots of ways that we could explore how we're going to further our goals as a community to be sustainable and towards energy efficiency. And, of course, you mentioned Amazon. And I would just ask you to consider, though, another way of looking at this, which is, while I think we could, there could be a rush to, quote unquote, just throw money at the problem, I don't think that that's what this is. I think I actually respect very much that Mr. DiFerenti has done his homework and has worked with staff and has identified a couple of projects here that are, metaphorically speaking, shovel-ready. These are not, to my understanding and my read of it, sort of pie-in-the-sky ideas. These are things that we know we can move forward on. And I think that they lay the groundwork that allows us to move forward with some of the bigger picture things that I know that Ms. Garvey and others are focusing on. So when we talk about what is happening around the region and where is our role in the region as a leader, and what is it that we want to bring to the table when we want to turn to some of our partners here, perhaps some new partners who have just joined the community, who we're going to be asking to push the ball forward and do things a little more bolder than what we've seen in the past. I think us being able to point to the things that we are doing on an ongoing basis, not waiting for the perfect, perhaps is another way to say it, but really moving forward with some solid projects that are ready to go. That's how I look at it. I do respect where others might be coming from, but I hope we can get to some form of some actual funding in the FY20 budget to do some of these projects. Real quick, Mr. Chair, I just want to speak to one item very quickly,
Sure.
which was the notion of the where you have rental properties as opposed to ownership properties. I know that we've had numerous conversations with staff, and one of the things that we're trying to unpack is the split incentive of what do you do when the person who is responsible for paying the utility bills is not necessarily the person who is responsible for making capital improvements that would lower those utility bills. And so that there might actually be an opportunity therein, again, to do something that's a little forward-leaning. And so I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. Otherwise, I do appreciate very much the work that Mr. DiFerenti has done to tee this up for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gutschall. And it is now a good time. I know you had a question on another issue. Do you want to keep the floor, or do you want us to come back to you after we conclude this piece?
It's totally up to you. I'm happy to go ahead. Once you get me, wind me up, I'll keep going.
I tell you what, why don't we conclude this piece, and then I'll come to you first. So get ready in just a couple minutes, all right?
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Sure, go ahead.
On the Minor Hill piece, I just wanted to suggest the Minor Hill facility solar installation, taking advantage of the new municipal net metering authorities that we have. This one actually, and I've signaled as much to Mr. DiFerenti, would have my support. To me, this really stands out as an opportunity that, simply put, we didn't have at the time the manager was putting together his budget. It's a relatively modest investment of resources, but I think what it shows is that it shows us expeditiously seizing on an opportunity that the General Assembly has created. And so this, I think, not only could potentially serve as a proof point for municipal net metering, but it also serves the kind of moral opportunity to say that when we ask the General Assembly for new authorities, particularly around clean energy, we are poised to seize them quickly and effectively. So I think, for my purposes, that Minor Hill facility solar installation, the site survey, the feasibility study really stands out among these proposals as something that wasn't considered, merely just considered or rejected by the manager of the air team, but actually really is a new proposal that has evolved over the time horizon of our consideration of the budget.
Thank you. So, just to add my voice to this, this is a tough one because, you can see the potential in all of these areas. And, the questions that I have, if we weren't having this budget conversation and these came before us, what would be our path forward? I would think that we would find a way. So I'm wondering to what extent it requires our treating this with the same degree of analysis that we have other elements of the budget, which for all of their merits, we haven't, as the five of us, really come together around briefings and conversation about sort of direction that we'd like to take with our future energy investments. And it feels, not that I find anything problematic about any of these, it just feels a little odd to be treating it this way. It feels somewhat out of order, and maybe to, I guess, just hear you say it again, Mr. Schwartz, something that Ms. Crystal asked you earlier, but if we were having this conversation in November, for example, if these were a couple of ideas before us, I'm imagining that you would be able to propose, if not all of them, if there were some that we were really excited about doing, none of these one-time investment costs would be impossible given various reserves and opportunities that you have to fund priorities.
They would not be impossible. As a matter of fact, I think it's highly likely that there would be these types of funds available from the sources I identified, which include we've included some estimates about receipts we're going to get related to the sale of the Edison property and Carlin Springs. I've been very conservative about that. I've been conservative about the savings we're going to realize in departmental budgets. And then we have, which I use very judiciously, the manager's contingent, and also the board has a $250,000 general fund contingent, which no board has tapped into for the last 3 years, but it's there for things like this.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would associate myself with what I'm generally hearing from Ms. Crystal and Ms. Garvey, who I think had a good way forward, is for us to come to some solid direction where we can really surface these, fully understand, explore them, figure out, are there other opportunities that didn't make this list? What would be sort of the universe of things that we can do so that we can figure out how best to deal with it? I know that leaves separate the question of, well, do you provide placeholder money today? It's generally not something that I support, putting pots of money that don't have a programmatic output. But given that I think anything that emerges is a clear board priority, we will have the ability to at least move forward. That gives me comfort to say, let's go direction now and funding later. But
Sure, and I appreciate both of you very much, and the way you articulated it, and there's a lot of agreement on so much in this budget. It's I think under the circumstances, it's a very well-crafted, the schools, housing, your priorities, our priorities are mentioned. With respect to the 50,000, I just think this is a big priority, and I fully listened and absorbed the lessons of the residential utility tax. I think it should be program-driven, but I also feel as though, certainly with the 50,000, I'm likely to bring an amendment on that with respect to the pumping station, and I certainly could be persuaded. On the other two items, you've raised a great concern on the 62,000. I'm not wedded to that. I would anticipate that it would be some combination of a budget amendment of 50,000 up to 252, but not necessarily that much, that I currently would be inclined to bring, but I would want to come down significantly. With respect to I think the game changer is contracts to do renewable energy that are not through the current system. And so I'd love your programmatic insights if you have them with respect to the 140,000 or 165,000 that we've discussed with staff, and the staff asked for the financial analysis. And I am not I wouldn't lean towards Dominion. If they can provide renewable energy, then I'd be interested. But I'd be interested in, some combination of an amendment plus guidance is the direction I'd be headed. And we have agreed on many things, and I want to respect both of your, as chair and vice chair, and each of you colleagues.
No difference required. This will be the subject of a majority vote. So, once you figured out what you like to propose, offer the amendment. We're just sharing perspectives here so that you can kind of get that general sense.
And there's only one, and there's only one other item, the alternative pay for that I'd love to get. I've asked, and Mark knows I'm mildly obsessed with buses and the size of buses as they're there. I believe in induced demand, and Mr. Leach also knows that this has been I've asked 2 questions on it. I'd love, if there are possibilities later today or tomorrow or Monday, it looks to me as though getting a bus that is a smaller size but still has the same maintenance parts as much of our fleet could save us some resources, and if that turns out to be the case, that would be an alternative pay for that's different from the one-time funding that I would at least love to see if we could explore just a tiny bit more over the next couple of days. I am mindful that there are transportation policy experts on our board. I am working up that curve, but that's the other pay for that I'd at least want to pursue.
I mean, Mr. Leach, you're in the room. I don't know if you're prepared at this point. You can defer. It's okay if you'd rather not. But do you mind just sharing a little bit about the impact of Mr. DeFerranti's proposed pay for?
It's already spent last year, and then the next time we do it, it'll be.
In essence, both, we look at the capital costs of our buses. We look at the operation and maintenance costs of our buses.
Sure.
We as a staff have come to a place where we strongly recommend heavy-duty buses because they're the only fleet that actually holds up to the rigorous conditions in the right-of-way, and they allow us maximum flexibility. The cost differential between a 40-foot bus, a 35-foot bus, and a 31-foot bus, which are basically the vehicles that we operate, is absolutely at the margins. Over 80% of our costs are actually driver, labor, and benefits. The biggest other determinant, the fuel is CNG. There's not much difference in terms of the fuel use between those 3 bus sizes. The most critical other thing than driver labor is maintenance cost. And so we're aiming to standardize our fleet and get buses that are highly reliable. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, so mixed fleets have higher maintenance costs. On a per bus basis, you're not saving a ton of money, and operationally it reduces the flexibility to deploy buses all throughout the system, because you couldn't, for example, put a 31-footer onto the 41 route because it's just not going to have adequate capacity. So it sort of limits your operational flexibility.
That's correct, and we've actually had a couple of instances before we introduced the new flyer buses where we were short and we had to put 31 or 35-foot buses on Lee Highway. And it turned out it was not a good experience.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Because it led to real serious overcrowding.
Overcrowding conditions, and as we all know from bus ridership, the more negative experiences you introduce into a bus rider's life, the increasing likelihood that they will no longer become a bus rider.
That's correct.
Could I ask, and is another way to put this in a way, and Mr. DeFerranti, I totally understand, because for years I've thought, why don't we use smaller buses? It's so intuitive, but what I kind of am getting out of it, and another way to put it is that it actually would cost us more to use smaller buses. That's what I'm sort of hearing. Maybe you don't want to actually go that far, but that's what I'm hearing. You start to add it all, that's at the margins, but it
We've
really
had
will cost us more.
experience with our light-duty 27-foot buses that they simply don't hold up to the daily driving conditions in the right-of-way. So they end up spending more time occupying our maintenance bays, taking up maintenance staff time. So any marginal cost savings that there might be by running a smaller bus, you end up eroding by taking up valuable maintenance bays and taking up valuable mechanic time to try to get it back, that bus back into service. So that's the thing that we weigh. And this board has made decisions to, when we have routes that are unproductive, we have either restructured or eliminated those routes. And where we have routes that are highly productive, like I would say the 41, the 45, the 55 only highway, this board has added service. So our service profile is also changing. We're running far fewer circulator buses, circulator routes, and we're running mostly all day into the late evening, what I call trunk route service, where the bus is going to be out there for many hours.
All right, so, I would say, while this particular pay for may not be the most desirable, Mr. DeFerranti, I mean this in full sincerity, I really commend you for seeking alternative ways to fund priorities that you offer. It's well done.
Both your second response is fiscal year 20, we're not spending on the 30-foot buses. So I would draw the pay for. I will next year want to know, it's $60,000 per bus, is according to what I read from the difference between the 30 and the 35. So let's throw this back to next year, and I'll be a little more experienced and not the right pay for, but I hope you can appreciate why I'm asking, because 60,000 from the heavy duty, if that is the difference next year when we buy 14, some of those will be on Lee Highway, and we should absolutely use them, and some of those might not be. And so, thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Schwartz.
regardless of how the board votes on a potential motion here, and if there is one, that would leave, I'm hoping that any guidance you provide would either direct me or not direct me to take on the initial steps here, which I think don't require consultants, which would require, for example, looking at our zoning to make sure that a solar array would work at the Minor Hill facility, and just there's some very preliminary design questions, whether that's something that the board would want to entertain, which would not require a consultant, which might provide more information. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm just saying, I just want to know whether, if you decide not to provide the money, that means stand down until we have a broader policy, or whether we could take some smaller preliminary steps. That's the question.
I mean, I would just say for me, that would absolutely be the appropriate first step. If we weren't having a budget conversation, that you would do your own due diligence within existing resources to determine what exactly to put before us as a recommended direction moving forward. That's the way we usually do things. That's where I'm much more comfortable. So I would be happy to do that if the amendment that is proposed does not carry.
And I think that it's more appropriate to do the amendment on next week when I've pinned down a few of these, and not today. Is that typical? Would you say the best practice? Okay.
Well, we're gonna vote on a draft on the markup. So we are. So if there's going to be, I mean, I would say if there's going to be something that materially changes this, we should try and do it today. Would be my preference. I'm sensing there are no more questions about the markup, and we've kind of moved into guidance and other preferences. So just for the sake of parliamentary sort of procedure, I will move the chair's markup for our consideration, and now it's open if there is a second to amendments. Thank you. While we're formulating ideas on the amendment, Mr. Gutschall, you wanted to raise something on the CSB, is that right?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you.
In your markup, as I understand it, Mr. Chair, there is funding for 1.5 FTEs, and of course what the CSB had, as we all know, had requested was 2.5 FTEs. And I wanted to understand, and I'm not, since I can't see in the room who's there, but if my question could be directed to the appropriate staff in terms of, if we fund 1.5 FTEs, but we don't specify which of those, by what process will they determine how that funding is allocated?
They will determine that based on what they think is the greatest area of pressing need. There is also the possibility that with the level of funding that we award that's intended to at least be able to provide 2 of those 3 functions, that they will be able to, through some other configuration of staffing, maybe meet 2 plus. They may be able to meet parts of all 3. So this would preserve maximum flexibility for the CSB to make the decisions about which position or positions to prioritize. Is that?
So that's the CSB itself, Mr. Chair, who would vote and determine that, or is that
Yes.
staff? Is that done at the staff level?
That would be the CSB. Am I correct?
It's whatever the board desires. I think that the CSB typically will take votes informed by the information they get from staff, so.
Right.
It's really DHS.
Well, I mean, Deborah Warren is the executive director of the CSB, so.
DHS with the citizen overlay. So but I think technically the decision, the funding is being made to the CSB. Anything more, Mr. Gutschall? Do you have?
So Mr.
Yeah,
Gutschall?
so it's a little bit clear as mud, but it sounds like from what I just gathered, it sounds like there would essentially what I'm a little bit concerned about, Mr. Chair, is that are we, and maybe it is the best approach, but are we just setting up where there's going to be a difficult process for the CSB? You know, we're asking them to figure it out. I get where it might be viewed as the most flexibility, but it might also be viewed as putting them in, pitting various aspects of the program against each other. That's my main.
I mean, just
concern.
having talked to interested parties, and maybe Ms. Garvey has another perspective on this, they view all 3 as priorities, but they're able to prioritize within the priorities that they send to us, if that helps you.
Yeah, Mr. Gutschall, they already
Okay.
have, but as we saw with the last position, if you remember the half position they've asked for, that's because they had a half position before and they couldn't fill it. They thought if they made it full-time, they'd be able to fill that position. And I wanted to give them maximum flexibility to make this work as well as they can, given the people that they have that they can get to fill the positions. And I didn't want to limit them. So, for example, if we said it was to be one particular position and they can hire the other one and they don't have somebody to hire for the one that we've given them, then they can't hire that person. And I didn't want to put them in that position. They have worked it out. They make difficult decisions all the time, so I'm pretty comfortable that they're able to do that. I understand your concern there. But in thinking about it, I really wanted to give them maximum flexibility to make the best use of this 1.5 FTEs that they can, and I trust that they're going to be able to do that. I don't want to tie their hands so that they might find themselves in a situation that they can't use some of this money or some of these positions because they can't make it work with what they're able to get. Does that make sense?
Well, I do know that, yes, and I do know that they have that half FTE that they basically could not fill. So that line of argument makes a lot of sense. So I appreciate the explanation, and I will certainly defer to your judgment and expertise on this. So I'm satisfied. Thank you.
No, I think it's great that you raised that. And, among the 3 potential options, obviously they would have preferred all 2.5 positions, but absent that, they would prefer the flexibility than the county board making the decision today.
Makes sense. Thank you.
All right.
So I'd like to see if the chair would be amenable to a friendly amendment. I don't know what the process is under the way we framed it, where we brought forward the motion.
It's been moved, seconded, so this is on the floor. If you'd like to change it, amendments, which
Yeah, so-
would also require a motion and a second.
Okay, so I would move to amend the main motion to add $50,000 to line 70 for the purposes of a feasibility study, and that $50,000 would come from line 56. And the feasibility study, to be clear, would be for that pumping station solar possibility. So that's the motion.
So moved and seconded to add a line item of additional county board spending for $50,000, which would be for consultant costs for a solar installation at the Minor Hill facility, with the offset coming from reducing the land acquisition fund to $9,950,000. Is that correct?
Yeah, and this does not preclude guidance in addition, it's just I do want to make that motion.
All right, you want to speak to that, or have we had enough on that?
No, I think this is legislation was recently passed in Richmond. I think this is an opportunity, and I do think it's important to move forward on a pressing challenge that we all agree on at the national level and locally.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, a question for the manager. Mr. Schwartz, you said that there are probably some funds that you can use to do much of this that would not be land acquisition funds. On the flip, say that we need that 50,000 for a land acquisition, are those same funds able to go into land acquisition?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just speak to it, and I'll just say that, there's certainly no reason for me to oppose ultimately something that's $50,000 that could potentially lead to, something that I think is an overall net positive. I do want to make sure that hopefully with budget direction that you will take the lead on drafting, that we don't disallow for the normal process of doing the appropriate due diligence without engaging a consultant so that we can properly scope how exactly we need to retain outside consultative expertise. I don't want us to immediately leap to putting $50,000 in the street until we fully wrapped our heads around what we're buying. So if I get your promise that your guidance will contain that, this amendment will have my support.
Yes, it will. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Gutschall, I know this is a priority for you. You good? We're going to move to a vote.
I am good. I'm ready to support the motion.
All right, so we're going to move to a vote on this. All in favor of the amendment to reduce land acquisition by $50,000 and creating a line item for consultant costs, potentially for a Minor Hill solar installation. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Great, the ayes have it, 5-0.
Thank you, colleagues.
Main motion is so amended. Any other amendments? Ms. Crystal, no, you're good? All right, so are we ready to vote on this, and then we can move to a discussion on further guidance if we'd like? All right, well, seeing no other conversation on the mark for the FY 2020 budget, properly balanced and amended to include the change as just noted. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
The ayes have it, 5-0. All right, terrific. So this will be the basis of the budget proposal that will be put before us on February 23rd. I'm sorry, April 23rd? April, please. That's right, April 23rd. If I could turn back time. So on April 23rd, we'll be considering this and all of the other associated fees, which again, what this means for the Arlington tax-paying community, this is a 2 cents increase over FY19. Certainly, we don't arrive at any increase lightly, but the board did advertise up to 2.75 cents, and this is coming in substantially below that. And remember, the way this all balances, 1/2 cent of the tax increase is devoted to county government operations, and 1.5 cents to provide for the ability to, within a rounding error, meet the request that we heard from the school board last week. And dollars and cents wise, that's a little less than a 3% increase year over year for households with average home values. So that is what we'll have next week, and let's maybe have a conversation about guidance that will accompany this. Oh,
Chairman,
please.
one, not really a point of order, but I just wanted to explain to everyone, we have 4 board reports that have not been posted on the website yet because we were waiting for this direction. And given that we will plan on posting them expeditiously, it was the real estate tax rate advertisement and also were the pay scales. So we will do that. There's a separate question which I leave with you as to whether the spreadsheet itself should be posted at any point. In the past, we have varied practice on that. And so it is, we can provide the detail of that the specifics as an attachment to the board report without posting the spreadsheet itself as
Yeah.
an alternative.
To me, I would like to do that as much as I think the spreadsheet gives a lot of explanation. It's not the full context of the entire budget, so that second recommendation sounds good to me. Okay, thank you. All right, budget guidance. We already talked about what I'd like to introduce about nonprofits. Ms. Crystal, are you ready to talk about what you have intended for arts and cultural affairs?
Indeed, I am. Thank you very much, Mr. Dorsey, and thank you as well as colleagues and certainly the manager for working with me on some draft guidance, the spirit of which I'll outline today, and then we can put forward in more detailed language on Tuesday. So certainly we've heard from a great many members of our community in reaction to the manager's proposed budget, which did include initially cuts to a number of what we might consider art-serving services, the costume lab, the scenic studio, colloquially known as the scene shop, the facilities technology services director position, and I think the real silver lining of that proposal is that we saw our arts community come together in a probably pretty unprecedented way. Reacting to that, our thanks to the manager for offering an amended version of his budget, in fact, a transition plan that restored some of those positions and features on a kind of bridge basis. So what I have sought to do is to prepare guidance for us to consider, or am seeking to do rather, will be preparing guidance for us to consider that establishes that board members accept the manager's proposed transition plan with a couple of qualifications. And the first, that these interim staffing levels will support more or less current levels of use. That's particularly true for the scene shop and costume shop. And also that we expect a more strategic funding proposal for the arts and these arts supporting services for discussion forthcoming in fiscal year 21. And so to that end, and this is really the meat of the direction on which I'm working, is that we are interested in a review of these community arts programs to be completed by arts stakeholders, county staff, including perhaps we hope maybe some county staff who might even think outside the box of cultural affairs, and likely outside consultant, particularly outside facilitation support. And we would like to see the manager return to us by July 1st of this year with such a proposal. We will have an opportunity both in the guidance I'll be advancing, but also as the scope for such a task force or community group comes together to talk much more specifically about what their charge might be. But at a high level, and I want us to think about capturing this on Tuesday because we do have the attention now of so many in the arts community. Mm-hmm. At a high level, we would be interested in having that group catalog the range of these arts supporting services provided by the government, provided by nonprofits existing, evaluate opportunities for public-private partnerships, or public-public partnerships with other governments in the region who might be interested in resources like the ones that we have. Many stakeholders have cited, for example, the new DC Cultural Affairs Plan. Develop transition plans beyond just what we're envisioning in fiscal 20 for these existing resources. Importantly, and I brought this up the other day in partnership in our joint work session with the schools, develop a new scheduling process for the joint use theater spaces. That's long been a bugaboo. And then really above all and throughout this work, really seek to align it with some important strategic work that has been done by our Commission on the Arts through the recent arts and cultural strategy, the Enriching Lives that they completed in 2017, the recently completed Framework for Arlington's Cultural Spaces, and I also hope this group will take advantage and apprise themselves of other existing land use planning processes, such as 4 Mile Run Lee Highway, et cetera. Although I think we'd like to be very specific, I assume we're all aligned on this, that this is not another siting facilities planning exercise. This is really about those resources such as the studio space, costume, scenery, construction, et cetera. Not because we don't care about performing arts venues, but because that has been so extensively explored in other venues and will continue to be. So that is I don't even know if it's accurate to say a summary because it was such a long description, but I'm hoping to capture that and bring it forward and want to thank our arts commissioners who have led, I think, in particular in turning this well-founded community consternation within the arts groups into something more actionable and plan-oriented for the year ahead. So that direction, again, would be for the manager to bring us forward a proposal by July 1 of this year so that we could get that group with its feet underneath it and starting to give us some good analysis and advice well in time for the fiscal '21 budget.
Yeah, thank you. I applaud you for taking that on, and it's important with the timeline that you've outlined that work happens so that we're not here again in a future budget year. Perfect. Other items? Mr. DeFranti, go ahead.
Well, I'm 100% on the 100 support. Thank you so much, Ms. Crystal, for bringing that forward. And I think it's a great discussion. I'm eager to move into it. Of course, I will work on the guidance on the issues we just discussed previously related to the environment. I do have one additional question that I would look to colleagues for insight. It's with respect to partnerships. One of the items we did fund Aspire with construction costs, which is reasonable, which is a appropriate one-time spending. But I didn't know, for example, I've committed to working on child hunger. I think that's a partnership type thing between the schools and the county, and there are appropriate functions that the schools should lead on. But I guess with the nonprofits, that guidance could cover it, but I'm wondering if you have insights as to whether partnerships that are related to addressing issues like child hunger or partnerships between the schools and the county would be an area where colleagues and you all would be amenable or interested, or would that be appropriate for guidance as well?
Thank you. Thoughts? Initial, unconsidered thought would be, to me that's a big enough issue, which as you highlight would necessarily involve not just APS, it would involve working with families. I'm not sure that we could come up with guidance to the manager that would be directionable enough to achieve, I think, what are your desired outcomes, but I'd love more time to think about it.
I
Ms.
was also
Crystal?
just going to suggest, I think that the idea of community-serving partnerships between county and schools is a deeply held interest among all 10 members of the two boards. And I am recalling, I think it has been part of the manager's letter in previous years to the budgets about sort of all of the areas you can find in our budgets where those partnerships are afoot. And so I wonder if it might be helpful to take a look at some of that from recent years. The manager, I'm actually thinking Deputy County Manager Cowan, who I think has personally worked on some of these issues, might be another helpful person within the county manager's office to direct to some good summaries that we've seen in the past. Whether it's on things like transportation partnerships, which we talked about at length at the joint work session, or more of these kind of community-type organizations that really do bridge county and schools. That's been an area of really sincere interest, and so therefore, kind of efforts on the part of the staff to summarize. So, I think something as specific as childhood hunger would probably require maybe a little more work on our end, rather than just direction of the manager. But that broader issue is such a good one, and as we have new board members coming in, it's also a reminder that we have new community members coming in who wonder why the county and schools aren't, quote, working better together. And so I think maybe an effort to kind of keep evergreen those past efforts to summarize could be really beneficial, not only for new board members, but for community members.
Sure, both of you are persuasive. It's not quite appropriate for guidance. I did want to surface the issue because it did seem to me to come up in the course of the budget analysis. So thank you both.
Great. There's some other areas that are also being worked in various capacities. One is we've had conversation a lot about the Glen Carlin Library this year. We are working on a concept of directing the manager to engage the community in the future of delivering library services within the context of that facility. And I would love to, once I work it out with staff a little bit more, to maybe even expand the scope of the library's direction to just figure out how we can move forward some of the manager's priorities of library services and what that would look like on the western end of Columbia Pike. I know that the River East portion near and around Roslyn is also a priority, so wrapping up, comprehensively the whole idea of sort of not the future of library service delivery in the meta sense, but specifically to solve those priorities that the manager has outlined, as well as making sure the community needs in Glen Carlin are met in a way that makes sense. Then there's also some guidance that I will draft on Metro to just make sure that the manager is fully aware and tracking the integration of Silverline into sustainable Metro funding. And there's some things that my particular background there will be helpful in just making sure we are clear with right away. And then I do believe also, in addition to the cultural affairs work that Ms. Crystal is drafting, the manager, I think, is going to give us some updates that can go into draft language on the dashboard concept for our energy and air reporting. And we'll also have potentially something on how the manager should utilize contingent accounts that we have. So that's the universe of what I know that we're working on.
Mr. Chair, and you mentioned earlier also guidance
On
on the
nonprofits,
nonprofits.
yes,
Okay.
and that too, yes. Yep. That sound good enough for this year? Mr. Gutschall?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you. I really very quickly would like to thank Ms. Crystal for the work that she's been doing with the arts community and pulling that language together. And I did want to ask, because I know how quickly time is going to lapse between now and next Tuesday when we vote on this, is whether or not the intent here with this guidance is to limit the scope. I know we can't have a totally open scope, but are we really trying to limit it specifically just to the issues that were at hand with this budget, namely the costume shop and the season shop, or are we looking to establish a process that needs some thinking in order to really go into to figure out exactly what that scope is? But are we, I guess if Ms. Chris could just maybe characterize how she sees the scope going, and I will opine that I think that it's my belief in the conversations I have had with members of the arts community that there is a yearning to kind of take the enriching lives and really take that now one step forward to make it more actionable. And the best way that I can think of how to think about it is to really, talk about is sort of like, what is the business plan for how does the county fund art? What is the county's role in the arts community at large? So a little bit bigger than just the very specific issues we dealt with in the budget, but I also totally respect that we can't have it completely open-ended. So I just wondered on how we were going to kind of pull that all together.
That's an excellent set of questions. Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to respond. I think it's probably somewhere in between just the future of the costume/scene shop and everything plays eventuality version where we're sort of talking about everything related to arts. I think the biggest thing that I am cautious of with respect to kind of establishing boundaries on this work group at the point of direction of the manager, and I do agree, Mr. Gutschall, the real proof will be in the pudding as we kind of iterate together on the charge to them. But where I want to really establish boundaries is to suggest that we are not going to reinvent the wheel of enriching lives. And in particular, we're not going to reinvent the wheel of the framework for Arlington's cultural spaces, which was the work product done by a subset, or led by a subset of arts commissioners, I believe EDC commissioners, Economic Development Commission, and a couple of community arts stakeholders. They did some excellent outreach to the community. We have a write-up of their principles and ideas about going forward on arts facilities. This is a long-standing and long-swirling conversation in our community, and I would like to make sure that this task force incorporates the work, learns from, builds on, but does not reinvent those efforts. I also am really cognizant, and I know you, Mr. Gutschall, as our multi-year liaison to the JFAC, feel this more acutely than almost anybody, that we really want to avoid looking like we're establishing another citing process in the community. So those are sort of the exclusions, or what I'm trying to avoid, or where I'm trying to put up boundaries. Beyond that, these things are tremendously interrelated, right? The arts grants are related to the arts supporting services, are related to the scheduling process for joint use theater spaces. And so I don't want to constrain or circumscribe the work of this group to the point where it's not productive. So I think a lot of that is to come. Again, the real proof will be in the charge that we come forward, and I certainly intend that any draft charge would benefit from the insight of the Arts Commission too. But at a high level, that's sort of how I'm thinking of it, somewhere between the kitchen sink and just the future of the scene shop, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense, Ms. Crystal. I think actually, from what I just heard you say, I feel like I'm in complete agreement. I think we would find that there's actually a lot of consensus there that this is, we are not, looking for spaces. This is not a facility planning exercise. And we are certainly, the full intent has to be that the enriching lives is the starting point and the jumping off point, that we're not looking to go back and revisit work that's already, great work that's already been done. We're looking to go forward. So I look forward to it. I think we're in good shape.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Gutschall. Anyone else with any comments about anything at all? Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, I just want to thank our chair for his leadership in getting us to this point. I tried a different method a few years ago when I was chair, and I would say it was a 180-degree difference. I won't do it again. Gave everyone heartburn. This was just great, and thank you for leading us through this. We're not quite done, but it's been great.
We're almost there, but it's only possible with the fulsome engagement of all of you. So that's terrific.
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to bring up a subject where I'm not asking for guidance.
Okay.
Because I had mentioned it to you, and we had talked about it in the budget, and it's apropos of the conversation that Ms. Crystal just had with Mr. Gutschall about the Lee Center.
Yes.
Which,
Right. Yes.
And so the reason why I'm not asking for guidance is I think that currently right now in the Lee Center, there are several kilns and artist spaces. The discussion of the kiln facility actually dovetails very nicely into this conversation of providing support to artists. So that's how we will talk about it there. And then the Lee Center itself is within the scope of the Lee Highway
planning process,
study.
yeah.
But I did want to highlight, so we have this, a fairly large expense coming up if we are to take the building and make it livable for an extended period of time. I want people to know we're just going to continue with the patching until we get to a more substantial point of, conclusion of this study and the Lee Highway planning study to bring that issue back as in those settings to have that conversation, because I had raised it earlier.
I imagine the risk that we have with patching is not the same as with the salt facility. But just trying to bring a little humor
I'm
into
looking
all
at
of our
Mr.
lives.
Moon, and he is giving me a complete blank stare. So he's going to come up and explain that.
I would first not make it analogous to the salt facility. I'll leave
I
with
hope
that.
not, yeah.
But I think the risk that we have there will be that we could have some one-time maintenance costs that could come up with that facility. I mean, as we look at the aged infrastructure there, everything from roofs, HVAC. But John Murphy, George May, the team is looking at that as we speak, and they're looking. The deferred concept that the manager mentioned is really how we're approaching it. And just in that, though, you never know when you're going, that useful life will run out on any of those facilities in the center, so.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Just, Mr. Chair, I want to add my thanks to you for leading the process, and we'll have all opportunities next week. But I do think DMF staff and everyone who's worked so hard on the budget to get to this point, I do not want to be in your shoes, but I do admire each of you a ton. It's a ton of work. And for the three of you, there's hundreds and thousand probably employees on our team who are behind you who's worked really hard. So thanks to the chair and vice chair, but also to the employees who've worked so hard.
Amen. Well said. And on that, no need to say anything else. We are adjourned.